When Lenhart and his associate, Dietrich Folklore, arrived, Claire was already there sitting quietly, wrapped in a white woolen cloak, her long hair slightly disheveled, and her eyes carrying a somber depth that sent a chill down Lenhart's spine. She offered a faint smile to Edgar, but in that curve of her lips lay a void and icy cruelty that was almost inhuman. Lenhart shivered slightly. He felt like a guilty man, as if it were he who had betrayed her. Wasting no time on pleasantries, Lenhart spoke, his voice steady and direct, as was his nature. "Claire, we've received a letter from Interpol. The Valmont family had a falling out with another noble house and later disappeared from Europe. We now suspect the perpetrator may be linked to the Nault family, the family of Lord Ulrich Nault. But only you can help us understand what really happened." Lenhart readied the camera. The shutter clicked softly tack and, then silence. Claire let out a faint laugh. But it wasn't the laugh of a young woman. It had a distorted hue, something that sounded like it had echoed up from a soul torn to shreds. "He was just a bastard. And that letter you read, the one they sent you, it's a lie." Lenhart was not surprised. Ever since reading the letter, he had sensed the stench of fabrication rising from every line. The Alaric Valmont family, though merchants by name, had deep ties to ancient bloodlines across Europe. They would never have sacrificed their entire legacy for a mere orphan girl. Edgar knew Valmont was anything but simple. Leaning forward slightly, Lenhart spoke again, his voice low but sharp. "Claire, tell us the truth." She turned her gaze to the painting on the wall, in the artwork. She was staring at her own reflection, through a pane of glass, a paradoxical metaphor, a human confronting the soul that had already been stolen. St. Lambert Orphanage sat nestled in a northern valley, once an old monastery. At the time, Claire had been a scrawny little girl with bright eyes and a keen mind. The orphanage was funded by an anonymous benefactor, someone she would later discover was none other than Alaric Valmont. But Alaric didn't just send money, he poured wealth into rebuilding the dormitories, upgrading the dining hall, hiring better teachers, even constructing an antique library. The children lived like they were in a miniature paradise until Alaric began meddling with how the students were sorted. He introduced something called a scholarship initiative, dividing the students into groups based on ability. The top-performing children were sent to affiliated schools under his patronage, places with strict surveillance and control, all under the guise of enhancing education. But Claire wasn't on that list. Even with near-perfect grades, she was placed in the intermediate group sent to a gloomy school, where the hallways reeked of mildew, and the teachers never looked the students in the eye. Claire once questioned it, but back then, simply being allowed to study was a rare privilege. She didn't ask again, she accepted it. And that was her first mistake. Time galloped like wild horses across the steppes of memory. By the second winter that blanketed the town of St. Gilles, Claire had grown up. Following the arrangements made by Alaric Valmont, the man she still called benefactor, she left her homeland to study abroad in Europe, a full scholarship, a letter of recommendation from a prestigious art foundation, Maison de Sender, and a placement in the classical painting department at the Fontainebleau Academy of Fine Arts all bore the mark of the Valmont name. Her mentor during the first year was Professor Armand Valmont, Alaric's youngest son, a man whose voice was soft and whose smile lingered like a thin fog over a pale, bloodless face. His eyes were a dreamy bluish glass, and he never looked at anyone for too long except when Claire was holding a brush. Everything seemed peaceful, even serene, until one afternoon during a human skull sketching session. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting a greyish glow across the canvases. Claire was carefully sketching the contours of a cheekbone when she suddenly froze. A frigid sensation crept down her spine. She glanced around, not just one, but nearly all her classmates, though they hailed from different regions, bore eerily similar features: high foreheads, long and slender hands, deep-set eyes with vacant stares. But then, that feeling passed like a sudden shiver down the spine. She told herself it might have been her imagination, or the influence of those paintings that depicted the decline of royal bloodlines so often mentioned in her textbooks. A month later, Armin spoke to her about a precious opportunity. The Academy wanted to send her for an internship in Maison Philippe Bijoux, a prestigious jewelry company managed by his second brother Antoine Vaumont, a company renowned for its clientele among the aristocracy across Western Europe. Claire didn't want to refuse. She couldn't refuse. Antoine was the complete opposite of his younger brother, a man who always wore high-collared black suits, never took off his gloves, with a voice cold as stone, and eyes like needles piercing directly into your flesh. At work, he was absolutely strict, yet during private meetings, oddly lenient, as if nothing truly mattered to him except profit. The first client Claire handled, after officially signing her contract, was introduced by a woman named Camille. Camille was the Philippe family's private jewelry advisor, and she said this client was very special and had to be served perfectly. Claire felt nervous, but everything went smoothly. The client was a Hungarian gentleman, tall and slender, with mist-covered eyes. As he left the drawing room, he smiled at her and held up a necklace, a chain of blood-red rubies, each stone glowing as if lit from within. The light from that necklace caused a slight tightening in Claire's chest. Not pain, just something strange, something wrong. But she couldn't name it. The next day, she went to the hospital for a checkup. Results: normal, all readings within range. Nothing unusual. She returned to work. Then Antoine announced the company was expanding its branches, and Claire, specifically, was getting a raise for having persuaded the important client to buy the most expensive set from La Collection du Sang. Claire felt relieved. Everything had a logical explanation. The client was pleased. The company profited. She was rewarded. A perfect circle. Then came the next phase of the job. And that was when everything began to change. The company launched a new project, private portrait painting at clients' residences, exclusively for nobles and royalty. At first, Claire refused. She didn't want to go to strangers' houses, didn't want to spend hours in cold, luxurious villas painting powerful men or powdered ladies. But Antoine said just one sentence: "You've done it before." Claire froze. A flicker of memory flashed like light on a blade. Yes, she had done it before. But when? Where? Those rooms, those faces, she couldn't remember. From that point on, she began painting portraits in clients' homes. 3 years. Over the span of 3 years, Claire completed more than 40 portraits, from lawyers, doctors, and chauffeurs to marquises, dukes, and even members of royal families from long-forgotten kingdoms. The strange thing was, after each painting, the client would visit Maison Philippe and purchase a ruby jewelry piece. Stranger still, the rubies always looked exactly like the first necklace. She once asked Antoine about it, and he simply smiled. Art is the flesh and blood of the spirit. During those years, Claire often felt something was off. The portraits finished faster than usual. As if her hand wasn't hers, the clients would stare at her for long moments after the painting was complete, their eyes filled with strange longing or regret. And the dreams rooms soaked in crimson, wordless singing, and faces too blurry to see clearly. But like everything else in that world, those sensations would always fade, as if a thin fog covered her mind. slowly erasing every detail, every trace of suspicion, until it could no longer be hidden. On a bleak winter day, with snow still clinging to the ancient eaves of the Vermont estate, Claire met a man she was certain she had never seen before, yet her heart trembled as if it had known him for a long time. His name was Matthew Vermont. In the Vermont family lineage, he was the last son ever mentioned, a man believed to be living in seclusion somewhere in the Highlands. And yet, there he stood before her, in a stone corridor, chilled with frost, his amber eyes slicing through every inch of her being. As she walked past him, she found herself blurting out a greeting with strange ease. "Good day, Lord Matthew." Matthew froze. His gaze snapped toward her, hardening as if he had just witnessed something far beyond reality. Without a word, he stepped toward her and, without asking permission, pulled her toward the West Wing office, a place no one outside the bloodline was ever allowed to enter. The door closed behind her. In the room filled with black velvet curtains and bookshelves carved with demonic figures, he began to speak, disjointed, bizarre phrases that made no sense, as if trying to fill the silence without touching the truth. Soon after, Claire felt something was wrong. Her body began to slip out of her control. Every step, every blink, every breath, as if they no longer belonged to her. She knew she was still there, her mind clear, as if watching a puppet being manipulated. And that puppet was her own body. Matthew had hypnotized her, but not completely. He used a strange kind of hypnosis, ancient and arcane, like an incantation passed down from pre-Christian rites. It made Claire forget his real face. Every time she tried to recall it, it blurred out, torn and shredded in her memory, yet strangely, her body continued to function, walking, talking, painting, as if she were living a different life, one staged by someone else. Then the portrait sessions at the guest house began happening more frequently. In a half-dazed state, Claire followed the company's orders. The first time was at the mansion of a man named Louis Corvain, whom she recognized as the one who had worn the ruby necklace that day. That gem, red to the point of glowing, as if soaked in human blood. Claire remembered that feeling, something beyond words, a mix of fascination and dread, like being drawn into a bottomless abyss. When she awoke in Mr. Corvain's cold room, she found herself sitting on the floor. On the chair sat the man himself, calmly watching her with a disturbingly amused gaze. She jumped up, trying to run, but every time she neared the door, an invisible force pulled her violently to the ground. It wasn't a person. It was something beneath the stone floor, a darkness with shape. It grabbed her ankles like a twisted game. He enjoyed watching her struggle, like a pet performing tricks. He laughed, a dry, hollow laugh, like rotting wood falling in a crypt. Her vision blurred, and when her dress was torn apart, she could only scream in her mind. But her body remained silent, like a lifeless corpse. It was then the door burst open. Claire saw Matthew Vermont standing there, tall and cold, like the shadow of death. For a moment, she thought he'd come to save her. But no. Matthew stepped forward and gently placed his hand on her forehead, like comforting a child, then whispered those ancient, familiar words that once again drew her back into the trance. But this time, she did not forget. In the mirror on the wall, she saw herself smiling radiantly, eyes rimmed with red as if about to cry, but she couldn't. She no longer had the right. Beyond the mirror, Matthew and Corvain were speaking warmly, like old friends reunited. In that moment, everything became clear. Claire understood that from the day she left the orphanage, everything had been part of a meticulously orchestrated plan. From the scholarship to the study abroad, from the discovery of her artistic talent to her promotions as the lead portraitist, Every step had been just one phase in a human manufacturing process engineered by the Valmont bloodline for generations. European women were carefully chosen based on beauty, intellect, and most importantly, their ability to paint portraits. Because for nobles, especially those who had forever escaped aging, a portrait was the only vessel capable of preserving a soul within a man-made form. She, Claire, was merely one link in that chain. Her memories began to return. Fragments once sliced away by hypnosis now flowed back like a river, finding its source. In her mind, scenes flickered. Sometimes she was a shy young maiden, sometimes a cold widow, other times a mysterious noble woman bearing the mystique of the Renaissance. Each role was tailored to a client's request, each portrait an act of possession. She had been dozens of women, but never herself. The first day she picked up a brush to paint a client, the red gem was placed beside her table. She didn't know it then, but inside the gem was human blood. Real blood, used to connect her to the one being painted. An ancient rite, preserved for centuries by bloodlines like the Valmonts. Deep beneath the Gothic cathedrals they secretly ruled. Each time a portrait was completed, the clients would visit Morris's jewelry shop to purchase custom-crafted red gemstone pieces, each one a gateway linking the painter to the painted. Each gem held a fragment of Claire's soul. And she was not a painter. She was a vessel, a sacrifice. Despite her efforts, Claire was powerless to expose the Valmont family's horrific secrets. Every path was blocked, every cry for help vanished into thin air, until one day, fate handed her a chance. On a late-night train crossing the Belgian border, she happened to encounter agents from Interpol. But by that time, Claire was no longer herself. Matthew Valmont, with those silver-grey eyes that seemed to peer through one's soul, had completely taken control of her. Like a soulless puppet, every movement, every word from her mouth was his doing. Claire wanted to scream, to act, to speak, but her body was frozen like stone. The last flicker of her will, like a candle in a storm, pushed her to a final, desperate act. She lunged toward the agents as they stepped off the train, but Matthew appeared just in time. He wrapped his arms around her and whispered sweetly, his voice like poison laced with honey. "Sorry, she's my girlfriend. Her mental state has been unstable lately. Sometimes she experiences delusions. I'll take her home." And so they left, leaving behind the agents with a hint of suspicion, but no reason to hold her. Yet the worst had not yet come. From the opulent salons of Vienna to the high-rise tea rooms of Geneva, word of Claire's actions had begun to spread. Those of noble blood, those who stood above law and conscience, knew all too well that if what Claire had tried to expose ever came to light, the fallout would not just be the collapse of a single house, but a mortal wound to the European aristocracy itself. Lady Cecil, head of the Western nobility's Iron Council, made a cold decision. Claire could no longer be allowed to exist in Europe. But if she were to be murdered here, a foreign citizen killed on foreign soil, Interpol would be forced to intervene. That would trigger a series of investigations no one could control. So, in order to clean up the matter, Lady Cecil ordered Claire to be expelled from Europe. The Valmont family took responsibility for escorting her away and ensuring that everything that had happened would be buried forever. In return, a young noble from House Cecil, one who had sworn allegiance to the old order, agreed to take the blame. Charlie, the son of an earl, would become the sacrificial lamb. Thus, the story was born. Claire had been raped by Charlie and heroically rescued by the Valmont family. A perfect lie, deliberately circulated through social circles and underground media. Over time, it became truth in the eyes of the world. Before leaving Europe, Matthew had carefully arranged everything. He learned advanced hypnosis techniques from a neuropsychiatric director in Zurich, ensuring Claire would forget everything that had ever happened on the continent. In her mind, there remained only a life woven by the Valmonts, serene, beautiful, but entirely false. However, Claire remained an uncontrollable variable. The Valmonts barred her from contacting the outside world. They dismantled all internal surveillance systems, fearing a single careless moment might reveal something they couldn't cover up. Matthew, now a licensed psychologist, forged her medical records and diagnosis, labeling her with schizophrenic memory disorder. Thanks to that, even if she recovered and spoke the truth, the police would dismiss it as the hallucinations of a delusional woman. At an old manor on the outskirts of Edinburgh, where Claire was being cared for, 3 men arrived: Jonathan, an independent investigative journalist, along with 2 associates, Adrian and Francois. They had been following the trail 4 years, and now stood before a completely different Claire. She spoke as if recounting a fairy tale, her voice monotone, her eyes vacant. But the camera was still recording, and the truth had never been silent. Jonathan asked slowly, "A month ago, you suddenly went mad in the plaza, ran across the area without cameras, then jumped into the artificial ice lake. Did you meet anyone there?" Claire froze. A flicker of confusion passed through her eyes. I woke up, but I couldn't control my body. That was the only way I could draw attention to the area without cameras. I don't know who he was." Jonathan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the message from one of his associates, then looked up. In Claire's eyes, he saw something melting, like thin ice cracking, resentment, defiance, and a primal fear. "So you killed Alaric Valmont?" he asked, the question cutting like a blade. This was a trap meticulously prepared. From the footprints Claire left in the blind zone to the time frame placing her near the scene, every piece of evidence pointed to her. Before Jonathan could react, Claire lunged forward, gripping his arm, her voice trembling. "No, I didn't kill anyone. She suddenly looked up. Her face twisted into an expression, both terrified and mad. Then, Claire burst into laughter, a long, echoing laugh that filled the room, as if coming from the other side of the grave. "I'm just a dream, a long nightmare." And then she fell silent, her eyes still locked on Jonathan's, unblinking. A deep, bottomless current was moving in her gaze, and he understood that Claire might never truly come back. In a land where truth is veiled in velvet, where crimes wear silk and pour red wine, is there anyone left sane enough to realize the nightmare never ended?